Hi, my name is Adam Walls, and I'm an Emmy Award-winning makeup artist. You may have seen my work in projects like History Channel's Roots. Have you ever wondered how to make and apply a silicone prosthetic with an added blood gag? Let's go have some fun. Alright, so today we're going to be applying a silicone prosthetic with an added blood gag. Now, if you want to see how we created the mold for that and the sculpture for that, check out the last video. I kind of go through that whole process there. But today, you're going to see me take that mold. I'm going to prep it. I'm going to run it. We're going to make a flat blood tube. We're going to glue it to the back of the prosthetic. We're going to glue that prosthetic on. We're going to make it bleed, and then we'll clean it up at the end. So this video, I've set up chapter points so you could skip forward. You could skip back if you want to kind of review a certain section. I've also sped a couple sections up because, let's face it, some of this is kind of like watching paint dry. Just make sure to stick around for the bloody stuff at the end. That's what you're here for. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get into this and have some fun. In our last video, we had just finished our mold. This, of course, is the final product. Now, whenever you pull your mold off of your sculpture, there's going to be a little cleanup to do. This little bit of silicone that I'm taking off with an X-Acto blade is just a little bit of material that dipped between the board that I sculpted the sculpture on and the stir sticks. I take all of this stuff off because if you don't, you're going to have something that's going to impede your silicone when you pour that up later. You'll see later in the video why this is important. In the meantime, it's just best to remove any little bits of flashing, any little bits of extra material that you have, just to make sure it's clean and you have some nice edges. The next thing I do is I take a little bit of alcohol and a 1-inch chip brush that I have chopped the end off of, and I get in here and I kind of scrub everything out. Now what you're kind of seeing me push on is there are little pockets that are in the silicone that actually have little bits of clay left over, so I'm kind of pushing them out like blackheads. Sorry for the gross comparison, but that's probably the best way to put it. You kind of go through and you kind of clean everything up, make sure you get everything out, because if you don't, all that stuff is going to get stuck inside of your prosthetic. The last thing you want is a little bit of leftover clay ruining the effect. The next thing you do is you get a little bit of Vaseline. I use this as a release. This way we have something in between the silicone mold and the vinyl barrier that we're going to spray on in the next couple steps. So what you want to do is go ahead and get this Vaseline in all these little nooks and crannies. Really make sure to get all of that detail covered. There are a lot of surfaces in there that need to be covered, so I make sure to go through and really make sure every single surface is coated. I find a really good way of doing this is putting a glove on and getting my hands dirty. Really get in there. You can feel all of the little nooks and crannies, and you know exactly what areas you missed. You'll notice that I'm also getting the sides of the mold. It's probably not a bad idea to get part of the underside as well. The last thing you want is silicone permanently sticking to your mold. For our next step, we'll be making our vinyl barrier that will encase our silicone. This is a product called Baldy's. It actually blends with acetone. You can see the consistency that it comes in normally. We're going to thin this down a little bit because that is just a little too thick to go through the airbrush. So I got a smaller container that I've already thinned down, and I'm going to fill it up because I've been running a bunch of silicone lately. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and fill up our smaller container with just a little bit, maybe about 1/3 of the overall size of the container. And then I'm going to take our acetone that I already have poured out in a smaller container, and I'm going to fill it up. I really want to make sure this is thin enough to go through the airbrush. I'll put the cap on, give it a good shake, really make sure it's mixed up nice and well. And again, we're looking for a very liquidy consistency to go through that airbrush. So I'll go ahead and I'll pour this into my airbrush cup. I'm going to put a little bit of acetone in there as well. And I'm going to mix that up so we can get the consistency that we're looking for. Once we're happy with that, I give it a little spray test on my glove to make sure it's working. And then I start spraying my surface. Now I'll go through and I'll make sure that every single surface of this mold is covered. I really want to make sure that no silicone is exposed. Everything needs to be covered with this vinyl barrier. Because of course nothing is going to stick to silicone except for other silicone. In order for paint to stick to this prosthetic later when we're painting it up and applying it, we need to make sure that barrier is there. I really need to mention that during this process, safety is really key. Making sure you're doing this in a well-ventilated area or a spray booth is ideal. Also, wearing a vapor mask is the best way to go. You don't see it in this video, but I am wearing a mask while doing this. You don't want to inhale this stuff. About 3 coats is usually what I find is best. You can always do a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on what you're doing in the end. The other nice thing about this is you can see the areas that you've already gone over. You'll notice a difference in the shininess of your mold. So that way you can tell what areas you've already done. For our next step, we'll go ahead and get our paints out and our flocking out because we'll be mixing our silicone and tinting it as well. These are my 3 parts to the silicone. This is my part B. And then we have our part A and our deadener. I'll get my trusty scale out and make sure to go ahead and tear that out when you put your cup on there. You want to make sure you're getting an accurate measurement. Once that's set, you go ahead and open up your silicone. The part B of Plat-Sil-Gel 10 comes out fairly quickly, so you want to keep your eye on it very closely. I only do a little bit at a time because it can get away from you really quickly. We're going for 40 grams. That's my goal. So I just kind of ride that opening a little bit and just kind of see if I can get it right up to about 40. For our purposes, 39 is close enough. Now I'll move over to my part A. You'll notice I'm using a new container. I don't want to mix the 2 parts yet because we're not ready. This comes out a little bit thicker, so again, it kind of comes out in globs, and you just get it right to that 39 number, and you're ready to move to the next step, which is Smith's Theatrical Deadener. This component allows your silicone to be squishy or less squishy, depending on what you want to do. We're trying to go for kind of an even, in the middle sort of squishiness, so you notice that it's 80 grams. My 40 of A, 40 of B is 80, so I matched that with my Smith's Theatrical Deadener. Just a little side note on that deadener, you can actually take it all the way up to 250% of your Part A and Part B if you really want something really squishy. When mixing up silicone prosthetics, I usually use a combination of a handful of different oil paint colors, and then I also use some flocking, which you'll see me introduce here in a few minutes. Now, my measurement technique is not the most accurate thing in the world, but since we're just mixing up a small batch, I usually find doing some small drops, if you will, is usually a pretty good way to go. So this is a color I've whipped together a handful of times before. I've used it in projects like Bad Boys 4. Generally speaking, it's kind of a generic light-skinned Caucasian color, and I think it'll work perfect for our purposes today. Now, you might be wondering if I'm using a specific brand of paint for any particular reason, or a special paint. No, not in this case. This is kind of just a generic oil paint that you can pick up at stores like Michael's. Now, I know that there are some silicone pigments that are sold on the market, but I usually find that these oil paints work just as well. Now you can see that I just added my flocking. Flocking is a really cool material that basically mimics the sort of capillaries and those little fine details that you get in the skin. The cool thing about it too is they come in all sorts of different colors. You can get them in red in this case, or you can get them in tan or purple or green or white. You can use flocking for all sorts of different purposes. Once I get all my pigments mixed together, now it's time to combine my Part A and Part B. Now, really make sure that you kind of push your mold off to the side. Again, remember that's been prepped and it's ready to go, so you don't want to spill any of this on your mold. Now you make sure to go ahead and get your Part A and Part B combined. I usually stick it to the other cup. Make sure to scrape out all the little bits, because again, you've measured this out exactly. After that's set, I mix that second cup up, again, making sure to scrape the sides and everything else, and then I add it back into my original cup. I'm really just trying to make sure that all the components are combined as best as I can get them. And just like when we made our mold, after everything's all mixed up, we're going to go ahead and stick this silicone into the evacuator. Let it pull all those gases out, let the silicone level drop like it is right now, and then we let it sit in there for about a minute. Once that's set, we pull that back out and we pour it into our mold. Now what I like to do is I like to pull the silicone way back and let it fall into one section. That way if there are any bubbles that get trapped in there, they can slowly work their way out. I fill in that one section and I try to go from one side of the mold to the other, trying to create one full solid glob that goes from one side to the other. That way I can use my cake spatula to kind of spread out the rest of the silicone into those channels along the side. Just be careful and try not to catch any air bubbles in there as you go. Once you're set with that, I get out a stir stick and I basically just scrape the edges. Remember when we took the edges of the mold off earlier in that first step? This is why. I really want to make sure that I have a clean surface that I can easily scrape that stick across. Once I've done that, I'll get out my tongue depressor and I'll go and look for areas like this. The key to having a good silicone prosthetic is making sure that your edges are that pure vinyl. So what we'll do is we'll scrape out that little bit of silicone out of that section, and we'll continue to go back over this area trying to feather out that edge. You want to make sure that there is no silicone around the edges of the prosthetic. We want to make sure that when we spray our last coat of vinyl, that the vinyl that we spray will be touching the vinyl that's already there. This is the key to having those great paper thin edges. Also, if you see any air bubbles or anything like that, this is the time to kind of catch those. Once we're happy with our edges, we go ahead and get the baldies out again with our airbrush and we spray the last layer of vinyl over the top. Basically what we're doing is we're making a silicone sandwich. The baldies is the bread and the silicone is the filling in the middle. This is essentially the last piece of bread. To get a nice good solid layer, I like to go over the prosthetic about 3 times. So you'll see me slowly work little circles all the way around the prosthetic to make sure that every little bit of this thing is covered. Now the nice thing is that you'll notice that the shininess of the silicone will change as you go on. That baldies has a slightly matte finish to it, so you can tell which areas you've already sprayed. After about 4 to 6 hours, this is what your appliance will look like. You'll notice that it's nice and firm. So I get out my powder brushes, I double check the firmness, and I get out the baby powder. Now essentially, if you touch this stuff without the baby powder, you'll notice it's got a slight tack to it. It's a little bit sticky. So in order to prevent the baldies from sticking to itself as you're pulling this thing out, I use this baby powder to kind of take that stickiness away. Now if you don't happen to have baby powder lying around, and you do have something like no color powder or translucent powder, both will work great. Just make sure that once you have your appliance demolded, that you give it a little clean with some soap and water. Now as you're peeling your appliance back, really make sure you get underneath as you're peeling this up, because again, you want to have this thing be totally solid. You don't want any wrinkles, you don't want anything basically ruining the effect that you've worked so hard to get to. Sometimes you can run into issues when you're demolding. Sometimes you'll notice that the detail will want to stick, your silicone will want to stay there. So I usually try to work around from multiple sides of the prosthetic. That way I'm not tugging too hard on one section. You want to make sure you don't rip anything as you go. Every now and again you might rip a little edge or something, and that's fine. That's something you can manage later, but you want to try to give yourself the best shot you can when applying your makeup. At this point, go ahead and get yourself a nice big old powder brush and go ahead and clean this thing off. Get all that baby powder out of there and give it a look-see. Make sure that you don't have anything that's going to cause an issue. I usually like to make sure that my edges are nice and thin, which it looks like they are. It looks like everything is nice and squishy, and it looks like it's going to do exactly what I want it to do. And the last couple things that I end up doing is I'll take this to a sink with some soap and water, and I'll give it a little scrub. I won't go crazy with it, but I want to make sure I get the Vaseline off the surface since we use that as a release. It'll also help get all that extra residue and baby powder off. You want to make sure that when you paint this thing up later that your paint sticks to it. I'll also go ahead and get rid of any extra flashing around the sides. Of course, this is our baldies that kind of got oversprayed from our little channel areas. Not a problem by any stretch of the imagination, just something to clean up and makes applying the prosthetic a little easier. Once that's finished up, we're going to go ahead and make our blood tubing. So first off, I'm going to use a product called Opsite tape. This stuff is great, it stretches, it moves with the skin. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to cut a few strips of this. I have the wider one, and I'm going to put a smaller piece in the center, essentially sticky side down. What I'm doing is I'm essentially making a blood balloon. Now one of the things that I really like about this product is there is a grid printed on the back of the tape. So when you're trying to match similar lengths, it's really easy to line up that grid and cut along those lines. Now these two lengths that I'm cutting are actually going to make the channel the blood is going to run within later. And you can see that I'm duplicating the wider section as well. Essentially, you're going to want to have 2 wide bits and 2 narrow bits. Now this stuff will tend to curl up, so make sure you have something to kind of help pin it in place as you're trying to peel the backing off to expose the sticky side. Once you get that off, make sure that you have another tool laying around as well, because once your fingers are on this, they're going to want to stay there. So in this case, my handy dandy tweezers are just the thing I need to get my finger off this tape. Now you can see that I'm grabbing my smaller sections now. What I'm doing right now is I'm trying to create a smaller opening for the blood to travel down in the opening of this tube. Offsite tape has a tendency to expand when it's inflated, so I want to limit that expansion in the beginning of the tube and also give me a good space to put my brass coupler. After the first side is completed, I go ahead and I do the exact same thing on the second side, making sure to pay special attention to the fact that this is supposed to be a mirror image of the other side. After that's done, I get a tool out to help me remove the second lining of this offsite tape. Again, you'll have a lining on the sticky side and you'll have a lining on the smooth side. Sometimes it's a little tough to get off, so make sure to have a little pointy tool with you to help get you there. Once that's done, I get my brass splicer out and I line that up in that small section of the tube that we made. Really make sure that this is flat and even. If you have any sort of weird bubbles or wrinkles in your tube, that's going to show up in your prosthetic, especially if you're working with a thin prosthetic like we are today. Now towards the opening of the tube, I really want to make sure that I'm kind of trimming off any excess edges or anything like that, and then also getting some additional tape to secure that brass splicer in place. Again, you don't want to be dealing with any sort of leaking blood down your actor or actress's shirt. They're already going to be sticky enough. The last thing they want is additional leakage going down their back. Once that's done, I inflate it a little bit just to make sure that there are no leaks, and I move on to the next step, which is painting our blood tube with PAX paint. Now the question you might have is, why are we painting the tube if it's going to be under the prosthetic? Well, because that blood is so red, you're going to want to make sure to paint the tube. That way that color doesn't show through the prosthetic. All of this stuff is really, really thin, so there are some cases where you can run blood under a prosthetic and you can actually see the blood travel, and it'll change the color of your prosthetic. You don't want that to happen, so I usually give a little bit of paint to my blood tube to basically match the skin tone of my actor or actress. Once you're done painting, go ahead and dry it, and you'll notice it might be a little bit sticky. That's because PAX paint is basically acrylic paint mixed with Prosade, which is an adhesive. Go ahead and throw a little powder on that, and that should solve that problem. Now the next step that I usually like to take is pre-painting my prosthetic. You don't always have to do this, but I do like to pre-paint my injury prosthetics because it'll save me time during the makeup application process. The last thing you want is your actor sitting there longer than they need to. So if you can cut a little time off of your makeup, not only will your actor or actress be really happy that they don't have to sit in the makeup chair any longer than they have to, but you're also going to make your assistant director staff very happy that you're getting your actor or actress out of the chair on time. Now what you're seeing me do is I'm taking this prosthetic through like a 3 or 4 color pass. Initially, I put a little bit of aged blood down first, and you can see me going in with the Ulta Blue out of the Skin Illustrator effects palette. I usually like to use this blue as almost like a shadow color. The nice thing, of course, blue and red make purple, and you're going to get those colors naturally occurring in the human body. You'll also see me going with some yellow, just got to give some little like fatty layered deposits. You can see now I'm actually going in with my aged blood again, and I'm kind of punching up those areas that I put the blue in. Again, making it a little bit more purpley and kind of really selling that deep part of the prosthetic. The next step I like to do is I take a little bit of my blood tone just to kind of differentiate that bright red color around the edges. Again, a lot of this stuff you're looking for contrast. You're looking for contrast between your lights and your darks, which all help to sell the illusion of depth. Now you can see me adding a little bit of breakup around the outside of the prosthetic, just some area on the skin to show that the skin is irritated. Just remember when painting, breakup is key. When in doubt, just make it messy. Lastly, the thing that I really like doing is I like giving some little highlights on the inside. When this is flowing later with blood, a lot of this detail that I'm putting into this prosthetic will get lost. These little bright highlights out of the regular Skin Illustrator palette tend to show through the flowing blood. These highlights sometime when you're painting it like this can look a little over painted, but since it is a bright color, once the blood starts flowing, that contrast will be really evident. After you finish that, just go ahead and start noodling. If you see any spots that you want to kind of hit, if you see any spots that catch your eye, go ahead and throw a little extra paint on there. One last little tip with these paints, they kind of work like watercolors, so you can get really washy with them or you get them really liquidy, and you can let that liquid find all those little spots and it will settle into all those cracks and those little deep parts of your prosthetic. But most importantly with this, have fun with it. You're painting. Once we're done painting, it's time to glue our tube to the back side of the prosthetic. But before we glue anything down, we really need to make sure we think through how blood is potentially going to flow through this tube. Since we're going to be gluing this prosthetic to an arm, I'm going to hide the top end of the tube up within the sleeve of the t-shirt. This means that our blood will be flowing down and gravity will be pulling it towards the base of the prosthetic. And since our wound kind of has a Y shape, I want to make sure it bleeds from both sides effectively. Of course, liquid always finds the path of least resistance, so we're just going to try to put these holes in these specific spots to help it along effectively. My general rule of thumb is to create smaller holes where blood will travel the easiest and larger holes where it's the hardest for that blood to flow. That way we can make sure it comes out the way we want it to. Now you can see that I was blowing up my tube. That way it's a little easier to cut through just the top layer and you're not cutting through your entire tube. Now you also do need to cut your prosthetic to make sure that the blood can flow out of that as well. So you line up your holes accordingly and really make sure that you can get them into that exact spot. Now at this point you have a decision to make. What do you want your final blood flow to look like? Do you want a stream of it shooting out? Do you want it to flow naturally and ooze out? How you line up your holes can determine what that looks like in the end. Once I have that set, I go ahead and get out my silicone glue. And in this case, I'm using Westmore silicone adhesive, which is a really good silicone glue that I like to use on set. You can see that I'm taking my time and gluing around each one of my slits in the blood tube. I really want to make sure that each one of my holes in the prosthetic and in the tube are completely surrounded by glue. Once that's set and dried, I give it a little test just to make sure that everything is secure and I don't have any leaks, and then I am good to go. I mean, you can pick it up later, but
I know.
We're going to chat first because it's, of course, recording.
Yes. Sorry, I was dealing with work.
I know you were. So am I. All right, so we are here today. This is my lovely wife, Melissa, who has been my poor victim for many years at this point. I've almost been doing this for almost 20 years, and she's kind of been here every step along the way. How many things have I glued to you over the years?
I don't know, but you made me look like the crypt keeper once.
I did. I was trying to figure out how to use Old Age Stipple because I had never used it before, and I ended up throwing it all over her face. We'll do another video about the do's and don'ts of Old Age Stipple and how that works, but that's you learn by making mistakes. That's the best way to learn this stuff. So do it, screw it up, and do it again.
And I am your crash test dummy.
Yes, this is the official crash test dummy of the day. So, all right, so we're going to get into this. We've got our prosthetic here. I've already got the blood tube, of course, glued on the back like we did that last step. So what we're going to do is we're going to line it up, make sure it lines up to Melissa's arm the way we want it to. I'm going to go ahead and grab this guy here first. And always what I end up doing when I'm starting this sort of process, I line it up, make sure it's going to go where I want it to. Of course, the blood tube has got a slight angle this way. What I'm hoping is going to happen is I'm hoping that it's going to bleed from here down and from here down. That's my goal. So we'll see if we hit it at the end. If not, we'll go through a couple ways that we can kind of tweak it to make it work for our purposes. Because you never know with a blood gag. Blood gags always kind of do what they want to do. So in the meantime, what we're going to do is we're going to get this set right here, which I kind of like this placement. We're going to get that set there.
Are you going to need my arm bent or straight?
I'm going to keep your arm like that, yeah.
Okay.
So this is a good example of make sure you put your actor or actress in the position you need them in. In this case, we're going to kind of keep her arm in a relatively neutral position, because if she bends the arm back this way, the skin is going to catch the edge of this prosthetic and might wrinkle up in a weird way. Or if she brings her arm all the way that way, it's going to stretch out this part of the skin here. And so by the time she flexes her arm back, again, the prosthetic is going to bunch. And we don't want the prosthetic to bunch. So, but this is a pretty good position. We're going to go ahead and put it here and then kind of go from there. So before applying any prosthetic, the first thing you need to do is clean the skin. The thing I like using is Kiehl's Blue Astringent. It does a really good job of taking any excess oils off the skin. And then after that dries, I get out the Telus' Top Guard and I use that as a barrier to protect the skin. We are going to be using lots of adhesives and some harsh chemicals on the skin, so we want to do our best to kind of protect the skin. So it's also really key if your actor or actress is going to be wearing a prosthetic like this for multiple days in a row in the same spot. For our next step, we're going to be using our Westmore silicone adhesive to start locking the appliance into place. When I glue any sort of prosthetic down, I usually start at one point in the center and use that as my anchor point. I go ahead and get my glue on the skin and on the prosthetic, make sure I dry it, and I make sure that it's nice and secure. Now you can see I'm kind of working on the top side as my second anchor point. I really want to make sure I lock in these 2 points. That way I have a lot of flexibility around the edges of my prosthetic to get rid of any sort of wrinkling and make sure I can really finesse that edge the way I want to. Now you can see that I'm kind of messing with the tube up top. The reason being is I want to make sure this tube doesn't twist or turn in any sort of weird ways. So I get a little extra piece of opsite tape and I make sure that's secured in place so we don't have any issues. Now I go back to my silicone adhesive, and now I start kind of working on my sides. I will usually leave about 1/4 of an inch around the edge. That way, if you see any sort of wrinkling in that flashing, you still have some flexibility and you're able to kind of tweak that edge where you need to. Can you see how I'm pulling on the flashing of the prosthetic? The reason I'm doing this is you want your prosthetic to be taut, you want it to be tight, but not overly tight. If you stretch that thing too far, you're going to get some weird lines in your edges of your prosthetic, which isn't going to look natural once you're done. You'll find with a lot of these prosthetics that they almost have a mind of their own. There is a natural state that they want to be in, and your job as the makeup artist is to glue that prosthetic down in that state. Make sure it's flat and it's even. You're not going to get any weird wrinkle lines. So that's why you see me going around the edges, kind of lifting places where I need to and re-gluing it back down to make sure it is in that natural state. And once you're in that position, then everything will lay down and you won't have any weird buckling around your edges or anything like that. Once I get the bulk of the prosthetic down, you can kind of see how I'm starting to work on those edges. Remember I told you I left about 1/4 of an inch? This is why. This little area right here can make or break the way your prosthetic looks. You want to make sure you don't have any of those tiny little striations, those little wrinkle lines, and you kind of use this moment to go around and inspect everything. You can see me poking at an air bubble. I managed to trap a little bit of air right there. It's all good because you can fix it. You notice how I'm using my brush to access that air bubble? I've actually put a little bit of Westmore thinner on my brush, and I'm using that to lift the prosthetic off the skin to get access to the bubble. Now I get my hairdryer back out, I kind of dry that section out, and the nice thing about it is you're not removing the glue, you're just loosening it up. So once you dry it, it should go back down. For our next step, we're going to go ahead and get out our acetone, and we're going to use this to blend off the edges. I usually start at one point, kind of snip the flashing, and I slowly work my way around the prosthetic. And because you're slowly working around the prosthetic, this gives you another opportunity to make sure that your edges are down flat. If you have a little area that's lifting, get in there with a little bit of glue and hit it if need be. Now the other thing about acetone is it is a powerful solvent, so I usually like to try to keep this on the prosthetic as much as I can. Basically, if you're doing your job right, the amount of acetone that hits the skin should be no more than what you would get at a nail salon. The last thing that I'd say while doing this is as you're dissolving those edges and you're pulling on that flashing, don't pull too hard. Sometimes you might pull a little much and you might create a little wrinkle in your edge. Obviously you don't want that. So now you can see that I'm grabbing a red sponge, and I'm also grabbing another material called Mel Gel, or Prosthetic cream. Now this stuff is really kind of cool. I get a little bit on a pad, and I get my sponge in there, and essentially what I'm doing is I'm doing two things. I'm sealing the edge of the prosthetic, but I'm also creating a little bit of extra texture. Now you can remember that when we made our sculpture, there's no texture out there on the end. And of course, those are the edges that you dissolve. So what I'm doing is I'm bridging the gap between the texture of the silicone prosthetic and the texture of the skin. This is a really good way to make sure that your prosthetic really blends into the skin naturally. After I get a good coat on that, I get my dryer back out, and I make sure everything is nice and dry. Now because that Mel Gel is actually a glue, I'm using my RCMA no color powder to take that tack away. This is a really important step because if you forget, I've had the occasional actor touch the prosthetic and then realize too late that it's sticky. It's not fun when you have to unglue someone's finger. Now that final seal that I'm using is actually taking away the white haze that was left over from the powder. I usually do this so I'm not fighting that haze when I start my painting. So for this prosthetic, I'm going to be using the Skin Illustrator alcohol paints. So this first color I'm going to be using is a color called Rose Adjuster. You can see that spatter pattern that I'm painting. I'm going to be using that spatter pattern over this prosthetic today with all of my colors. When you start thinking about skin and how skin is colored, it's not just one single color. It's a whole bunch of different colors all kind of layered on top of each other. So what I'm doing is I'm using that red to kind of bring in those kind of undertones that is in Melissa's skin. Now my second color I'm using is another adjuster. In this case, it's Olive Adjuster. Now there are a million ways to skin a cat, and there are a million ways to paint up a prosthetic. I personally like painting with all of my adjusters first. Now I'm just going in with it red again, and just kind of punching up a couple little areas that I thought might need it. After that, I start going in with a natural one. Now this color is just kind of a generic light skin tone color, and I just kind of spatter that on top just to kind of lighten it up a little bit and kind of start blending it down into her skin. When painting, you can see me making little circles with my airbrush. Just always keep your airbrush moving over all of those surfaces. If you linger too long in one spot, you'll notice the paint becomes really heavy in that area. You'll want to avoid that because it becomes pretty obvious that there was something going on there. Now you can see I'm going back in with an olive now, and the reason I'm doing that is because there were a couple areas of this prosthetic that were looking a little too red. Just keep the color wheel in mind when doing this. What's across from red? Green. Those two colors will balance each other out and help to kind of calm things down, if you will. Now I'm noticing a little bit of a color difference between Melissa's skin and the prosthetic, so I'm going back in with that natural one just to try to help bridge that gap a little bit more. Once I'm happy with that, I go ahead and I use a little bit of cool tone. Now when you look at this prosthetic, it looks a little warm to me. This cool tone does a really good job of kind of mellowing out the color a little bit. Once I'm happy with that base color and the overall blend, the last color I'm adding is a cedar brown. I opened up the cone on my paintbrush and I dropped the pressure way down so it really spatters that paint. Adding freckles is a fantastic way to bridge that gap between the actor's skin and the prosthetic. Once we're happy with the paint, I go ahead and get out my EBA Pro Seal. This is a fantastic sealer that you can actually run through your airbrush if you thin it out. I always apply a few coats of this and then make sure to dry it off with your hairdryer afterwards. Since we're going to be dealing with a lot of flowing blood, having a sealed makeup is key. Once that's dried, usually what I like to do is I'll get my Illustrator palettes back out and I'll go back over the wound with those red colors. The reason I'm doing this is because we've been spending the past 20 minutes airbrushing all of this additional color around that prosthetic. So the interior of the wound has gotten a lot of overspray and extra color. So I'm using the red out of the Illustrator palette to really punch up the interior of the wound, and I'm also adding some extra irritation to the outside. Again, making it messy is really the way to go. After that set, I get my gel blood out, and I go ahead and kind of punch up those little deep areas with that, and I get my dress blood in there too. I want to get this thing started early. Now usually this is something that I'll do on set. I don't want an actor riding in a van or having to travel up and smear blood everywhere. So usually this is a last look sort of thing on set before you get the blood gag going. But because I'm sitting there with good camera angle and some good light, I figured I would do this inside before we got the blood gag going. Now you may have noticed that I actually had that little spritzer bottle out. That's actually just filled with water because all of these bloods are water soluble. When doing dress blood, I always have that spritzer bottle on hand to kind of help get a natural flow going. So first off, we have our sure shot. This is primed with about 30 ounces of blood, and it's about 30 psi. So we're going to give this a shot. Of course, we've got our tube hooked up to it. We have our quick disconnect, and that's going to attach the wire on the back of Melissa, or the tube on the back of Melissa. So we're going to go ahead and kind of get this primed and ready to go. First off, I already have our tube, which is, sorry, as I'm pulling her hair. We have the tube already taped down up here. That way it doesn't get twisted or get tangled. That way that's already there. And this, I'm just gonna run up the back of her shirt. And we're gonna go ahead and get this attached to our tube. Of course, quick disconnect. Tube just clicks right in. Essentially now we're good to go. So I'm gonna let that stay there. And I'm gonna kind of pull this back and we're gonna let this thing bleed. All right, are you ready?
Yes, it's gonna be so cold.
This is her favorite part. I've done this on her a handful of times, and blood is not the thing that she likes.
It's so cold.
You're already getting goosebumps.
I know.
All right, and so what we're gonna do is I'm gonna prime this tube so we can see it kind of come up here. And make sure it's working. Oh, blood's up there.
Yeah, I feel it.
And we're gonna see where it goes on 3, 3, 2, 1. So now that it's bleeding, now Melissa, go ahead and try to stop the bleeding a little bit. Go ahead, pull your hand back. Back again. So now a lot of times if you get those streamers, if you want a streamer there, great. If you don't want a streamer there, or if that's something you're trying to avoid, I would suggest having your actor or actress put their hand there. That way the blood goes like that.
Go ahead,
Or
do it
move
again.
your hand up. There we go. Now you can move your hand back a little bit. Okay, now let go. So that's kind of the idea. That's what we're trying to achieve.
What must
Now-
the neighbors think?
Now go ahead and actually I'm going to have you put your arm out this way.
This way?
Yeah. And so if you don't like the pattern of blood that's flowing in that, you can go ahead and put the arm out in a different position to get it flowing in a different way if that's if that's better or what you're looking for. How you feeling, Melissa?
Lovely. Living the dream.
So I'm going to let this flow to show you what happens when you're out of blood in these shore shots. Then put your arms straight out.
Okay.
Oh, is it going in?
Yes. I will put my arm out at this angle.
Okay, there you go. That works. And if you get any spots that have bothered you or anything else, like we're getting a little line because of her extending your arm that way, the nice thing about blood, now you're not even going to notice it as much. So at this point, once I've run out of blood in this canister, you can see that the air is starting to get in the line. I want to show you what the air does to this prosthetic. So if you start to see that, you know what's going on. As you can see, I got myself.
Serves you right.
I'm gonna step back. See all the bubbles coming out of there. Not exactly the effect that you're going for. But as you can see, that's kind of the long and short of a blood gag and how it works. How are you feeling?
I'm ready for a warm shower. Where are those cleanup towels that you get nice and warm for the actors?
Oh, they're inside where I forgot to get them warm. All right, so that was a successful blood rig. Now at this point, if you wanted to do like a second take, if this didn't exactly go the way you wanted it to, or if they were looking at trying to get from a different angle or something like that, the nice thing about this is because we sealed it with that EBA Pro Seal, and we did a really good job of making sure all these surfaces were coated, this is actually held up really well. I mean, you'd have to like try to repair a little bit of an edge that's popping up over here, a little bit of extra paint right here that you could get in with a brush and just hit real quick. But that's a pretty easy repair. So if you wanted to go again, you very well could. And besides, with blood rigs and things like that, if there's blood that's going everywhere, well, costumes is going to need a change. Your set deck folks are going to need to kind of clean up the floor. So there is going to be some reset that's going to need to happen. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and clean this up, and we'll go ahead and take it from there as she plays a video game on her phone. The other thing I'd mention too is this blood, generally speaking, most bloods that are out there are water soluble. So if you did need to clean it up and get it nice and fresh again with a quick little spritz of some water, you notice how that blood just kind of starts running. So you can very easily give that a little dab, get rid of that flowy blood, and then you're good to go. The other thing I'd say too is for cleanup purposes, start with water. We did this outside to start. We got the hose out and literally hosed off her entire arm. And as you can see, that took care of pretty much all of the blood. So now what we're going to do, well, with the exception of the staining, of course, but we will show you how you take care of that as well. So after removing all the blood, I go ahead and get my makeup remover out. Today I'm going to be using isopropyl myricate. The other thing I do as well is I get my removal brushes out. Make sure to keep these brushes separate from other brushes that you use. Since the remover is oil-based, if you use these brushes for painting or gluing a prosthetic on, you're going to run into a world of problems. Once I get an edge lifted, I just slowly start working the brush under the prosthetic. Really?
You're pulling on the hairs. All my tiny little baby hairs.
You mean the ones that are gone now?
Yes, I did not sign up for a waxing.
And yes, as my wife put it, don't wax your actor. I try to do my best to take it slow and slowly remove that prosthetic from the skin, but people are going to feel things differently. My wife's skin is a little bit more on the sensitive side, so I'm really trying to take my time to go as slow as I can to make sure I'm not pulling harder than is necessary. The other thing to keep in mind is she hasn't worn this prosthetic all day. We literally glued it on, painted it up, shot the gag, and then came back inside for removal. A lot of times if your actor is wearing a prosthetic like this all day long, they've sweat in it, it's been through the ringer, it's had liquid on it. So usually if you're at the end of a 12-hour day, usually that prosthetic is ready to come off. This is a pretty freaking good match, if I do say so myself. I'll just kind of point this out real quick. Usually when I'm removing a prosthetic, I have a lot of fun looking to see how far I've pushed the actor's skin, because sometimes you can get the prosthetic looking one way, but it doesn't exactly blend off into the skin until you start pulling the paint down onto the actor's arm or wherever. Did you just throw your AirPod behind my desk? Is that what that was?
It literally leaped out of my ear. I didn't do anything. And perfectly fell in the crack.
You have got a talent, my dear. But what I was saying is the color blend, obviously I'm rubbing the paint off here, but the color blend is actually pretty close to her skin tone from here to here, I'm kind of happy with that. Sometimes you pull it off and all of a sudden this is like white under here and you can see the amount of color you've put on top of it. But today I did good. Yay, I'll take it. Now the other thing that you can do to help with the removal process later is there was another product called Skin Saver, which is a lotion barrier cream. You can apply that to the skin before you apply your prosthetic, and that'll help with the removal process later as well. But at the end of the day, slow and steady is the way to go. Another technique that I like to use a lot of times is to make sure that I get a lot of that mirror state kind of loaded up in that brush, and I let it pool in the lower parts of the prosthetic. So many times when you see me removing a prosthetic, I usually start from the top and I work my way down. Again, let that remover pool in those areas, the lower part of the prosthetic, until you finally break through. Once you do finally break through that prosthetic, you'll notice that you'll get a lot of residual glue and stuff around the edges. So I usually get a puff or a cotton pad and I go ahead and I hit all of those areas. After that, shaving cream becomes your friend. Shaving cream does a great job in getting rid of any staining that's on the skin. Not only does it do a great job in getting rid of that staining from fake blood, but if you've got kids at home, and I have 3, it does a great job of getting food coloring off of their skin as well. Well folks, that's going to wrap things up for us. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, give it a like, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, that way you see new stuff coming down the pike, and make sure to check out the other videos that we've got on the channel. In the meantime, do you have any questions about the process? Are there any specific makeup things that you want to try out? Just let me know in the comments below and leave any questions as well. And as always, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.